I mean, globally, I'm no phenomenon, but my approach is a little unorthodox. Hi, my name is Dick Kid, and I'm here to save the world. Well, Laurel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I have been a fan of your work for a little while now. You have such an incredibly notable track record as a journalist, from your work with Vice to your most recent endeavors in Ukraine. I'm super excited to be speaking with you. From what I know about you, your career aligns so closely with some of my favorite journalists like Ben Anderson, Mariana Van Zeller, Sabrina Tavernisi, Ben Solomon.
All great people. Yeah, I just saw Ben in Ukraine, Ben Solomon.
I saw that. Oh, that's incredible. Wait, didn't he recently do an interview with President Zelensky?
He did. Yeah, he was there for Vice, and we were there at the same time. And I used to work for Vice. I knew his producer, and Ben and I had chatted before, so it was nice to finally get to meet and hang out in Ukraine.
That's amazing. Okay, actually, let me backtrack myself just a little bit. I wanted to kind of get a better sense of your background as a journalist and how you began, and then talk about what you've been doing more recently. You started your career at Coconuts, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So my first real media job was at Coconuts, which is this online news platform headquartered, I guess, out of Singapore, but it has sites all over Southeast Asia, and it does local news in each of those places. So I worked for the Hong Kong site, so I worked for Coconuts Hong Kong, and that's kind of where I cut my teeth as a journalist.
Oh, very cool. And are you still primarily based in Hong Kong?
Not really. So I left in late 2020 to start a master's in the UK. So I have been based out of the UK ever since. Though in the last, I guess, year, I've been traveling a lot, so I haven't actually been in the UK much. But technically, I live in England.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's funny. We were both playing like this game of phone tag. Like I had initially reached out to you, and then it had kind of fallen through. And then when you reached back out to me, you had like this super limited window of availability. I was like, oh, I better free up fast and get started on my homework here. So I poured myself a glass of wine and put on your most recent podcast. For those of you who don't know, it is called Resistance Stories from Ukraine. I got through the first 3 episodes, and then I saw the fourth one come out like right as we were about to start our podcast. I was like, oh man, I just missed it. So I haven't gotten a chance to listen to that one yet, but I will after this interview.
I haven't had the chance to listen to the final cut either. Yeah, fourth episode just came out today, so very exciting.
That is very exciting. Well, it is an incredibly powerful and profound series so far. I especially love the premise behind it. I know you had previously talked about wanting this podcast to shed light onto, the perspectives and insights of the people you photograph. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the podcast kind of came about serendipitously. I was in Ukraine, there, reporting and taking photos, and then a colleague who has this media startup called Project Brazen reached out, saw that I was in Ukraine, and asked if I'd be interested in doing a podcast. And for me, like, I think any journalist, you know, is interested in the audio space and the podcast space. It's so popular right now, and there's a lot of really exciting things happening with it. So I, said, of course, I'd love to do that. And the podcast sort of became, it worked really well. I could still take photos and I could still report, but it was just recording audio while I was doing it, essentially. And so almost all the stories in the podcast, I was also photographing. And yeah, so the podcast, so it's called Resistance Stories from Ukraine, and it's it's just talking. Every episode is a different theme, but it's just talking to different people around the country and getting the sense of what it means to be living in Ukraine, what it means to be resisting to the invasion, to the war, however, in whatever way they're able to, whether that's sewing bulletproof vests or being an actual fighter on the front line. So that's the concept of the podcast. There's 4 episodes so far, and another 3 or 4 coming out over the next few weeks.
That's amazing. And if you don't mind me asking, just so that I can get a better, sense of the timeline, when were you in Ukraine, and then when did you get back?
So I was in Ukraine. Gosh, I think I got out. I think I went early March, and I left mid-April. So about a month ago I left. And so I was there for about 6 weeks, and then I'm hoping to go back again in about a month's time.
So, Laurel, did you just decide to go off your own accord, or were you partnering with specific organizations? How exactly does that work?
Yeah, I went in independently as a freelance journalist with no gig set up. I think I went in with a few friends and colleagues, fellow journalists, a couple security experts, and I think we all had a desire to be there to cover what was going on, and we just had a group of friends who had the skills and connections and resources, and we realized we could go in responsibly and safely as a unit, and it worked out. So it was me, my colleague Arman Jijovic, that I made the podcast with. He's a videographer, and he recorded the podcast. Went in with a couple other security experts who essentially acted as our security, which is important to have in a conflict situation. And while we were there, we just picked up work, and the podcast is one of those projects that came out of it. We also made a video, an 18-minute documentary that came out last week. So few things still trickling out over time there.
Okay, I actually got a chance to watch that short documentary yesterday, and it was super powerful. I thought it paired incredibly well with the podcast. I remember when I talked to Ben Anderson on a previous episode, he had mentioned, just how difficult it is to see such traumatic events over and over again. I guess I'm wondering, when you go into a situation like the conflict in Ukraine and you come back, how are you sort of processing what you just witnessed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and one that I don't think I've really figured out for myself. I think as a journalist, you do have to sort of keep everything at a bit of an arm's length, just because it's not humanly possible to absorb and process everything you see. I don't think there's a person who has the capacity to truly understand and wrap their head and heart around what's happening. So I think you always, to some extent, have to keep the story at a bit of an arm's length. But it's also hard because as a journalist, one of your main tools is empathy. So I don't know. I think I mean I was back for about a week, and then I went straight into a shoot in the Congo for 2 weeks. So, I'm not really sure I have processed everything, but it's always an adjustment. I think, it's nice when you're with people who went through similar things or who are there with you and they understand. But I think when you come back, when you go back home, the people around you don't really understand what you saw and don't really know how you feel. And I don't know, it's tough. I think it's really important to be self-aware and take care of yourself and, sleep and eat well and exercise and do the things that you enjoy. So I don't know. I don't know if I have processed it all, and I don't know that I can necessarily give very good advice, but it's I think it's a constant struggle when you're a journalist covering these things is trying to make sure you're taking care of yourself.
Yeah, that's great that you mentioned self-care because I was actually going to ask you about that. Are there any specific tools or coping mechanisms that you use to sort of decompress your mind after being, out in the field? Because I imagine it's difficult because you're always going from, one thing to the next.
Yeah, I think I mean for me, I'm an athlete. I'm a very active person, and for me, I think as long as I feel like I'm taking care of my body and I feel good physically, then I can sort of handle whatever comes my way. Like if I because there's always going to be questions of like not getting enough sleep or maybe like, having to skip meals and just facing difficult challenges and difficult stories and conversations. And I think for me, like as long as I'm exercising and eating as well as I can, which I do, like even when I'm on the road, I aim to exercise every day. Obviously, in practice, that doesn't really happen, but like I aim to exercise every day. I bring simple exercise equipment with me so that there's no excuse. I bring like meal replacement shakes with me, so that I can still stay on top of my nutrition, even if the conditions are challenging. So for me, it's like if I feel like, and I also don't really drink. I don't drink much. And I think all those things just help me cope because if my body feels okay, if I feel like I have the energy to keep going, then it just makes it easier to adapt and to cope and and it keeps you grounded too. I think obviously exercise makes you feel good and endorphins clears your mind, but I think like when I feel grounded and connected with my body, then I kind of just feel grounded in general. So I think for me, exercise is really important. So I just over the weekend, I played in a rugby tournament, which like for me is
Oh, very
huge.
nice.
Just to yeah, just to like not just exercise, but do something I love and like kind of just have fun and be outside and be with friends. Like for me, that's really important.
I wanted to eventually talk more about your work life balance, but because I only have you for so long, I wanted to jump to the podcast for just a second. Um, After listening through, I kept going over these unbelievably powerful moments in my head from Sasha and Olga's reunion with their old neighbors to Arthur, the beekeeper slash drag queen, his intricately arranged cosmetic set, which was sort of this beautiful sense of normalcy amidst such a chaotic and catastrophic environment. And I guess one thing I'm wondering is were there certain signs of hope or prosperity that you looked to or maybe sought out within the destruction and calamity that was surrounding you?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's part of what makes it so difficult to describe my experience in Ukraine to my friends and family because obviously they ask like how was it? You know, they know that I saw terrible things and that it was difficult. But on a really meaningful experience in that it was so incredibly special. You could feel how this whole country, this whole nation had rallied together and they all were working towards something that they felt was bigger than them, that they felt was more important than them as individuals. And there's so much solidarity and selflessness and courage and kindness and warmth and openness. And it was truly amazing to see how a country could rally like that, and like whether they were like biologists and drag queens, or, you know, like language teachers, or, you know, all these regular people who didn't ask for it, but who have had to rise to this incredible threat to their very existence. And to me, like as a journalist, you know, it was such an honor and privilege to be able to meet these people and tell their stories, and for them to, you know, not just tolerate our presence during such a difficult time, but also like actually welcome us, and take the time to share their stories and invite us into their lives. And so it was, you know, of course there was a lot of death and destruction and tragedy, and senseless death and all that, but being able to, and I think in these kind of situations, and as a journalist, you get to see what humanity is capable of, and it's so much more than any of us think. And Ukrainians really blew me away. And you know, when you see a whole country work together like that towards this one singular goal, it kind of gives you, it did give me hope. You know, if we could all, if a country is capable of that, you know, who knows, like imagine what we'd be capable as humanity if we all decide to rally against towards the same thing, you know?
Yeah, no, that's amazing. It gave me hope for, you know, humanity just listening to these stories. I think the podcast, especially coupled with the mini documentary and your photography, really solidified the actuality of these people's experiences for the world to see. You know, making it all the more authentic to those of us who are not in Ukraine, witnessing this. There are a few little moments in the podcast that I particularly loved. When you were talking to the Ukrainian music producer, you told him that his song was a banger. I was really geeking at that. And then there was this other guy you were interviewing who started singing this song called My Happy Valentine, which for some reason I really loved that.
Yeah, I think that's what I really enjoyed about making the podcast. You know, I'd been on podcasts, but I never actually made one before. And you get to capture all these like candid moments that I think, you know, are like very human and relatable and just normal. And I think for those of us lucky who don't experience war, you kind of can't quite imagine what is like, or you know, it's something so foreign and unthinkable. But when you do hear moments like that from regular people who are in war, or even have like picked up guns, and you're like, oh yeah, they're just regular people. So yeah, I'm glad to hear that those moments resonated with you.
Yes, wow. Well, they definitely did. There was also another story on the podcast which really demonstrated the kind of brutality and demolition that the Russian military is after. It was involving Russian troops pillaging this farm and trying to destroy and ultimately kill the livestock on the property. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this guy who owned this horse farm that, you know, was called Sunny Valley, and was intended to help veterans and kids and their families with PTSD to recover. He had fought for Azov, which is this famous battalion that, you know, Russia claims is Nazi. So apparently when the Russians arrived in this town and they heard that this guy had fought for Azov, then they came to his farm and kind of, yeah, I mean, they destroyed it, and they shot at a bunch of animals, and a lot of animals got hurt. Some died. Unfortunately, Tarzan in that podcast did pass away from his injuries.
Oh, he did. Oh, that's so sad.
He did, yeah. So yeah, I mean, it, you do hear stories like that over and over and over, just like small, not small, but just these anecdotes after anecdotes of so much awful cruelty and inhumanity that really is hard to understand. And I think we're still just figuring out the scale of what happened. And it's it's pretty, some of it's almost hard to believe, right? But I think, you know, humanity time and time again throughout history has shown capable under the right conditions of unbelievable inhumanity and cruelty. So I think that's, we're starting to understand just what the Russian army has done and is continuing to do in Ukraine. It's pretty awful.
Yeah, it is absolutely so terrible, and I don't know if we've touched on this yet, but I know that there has been quite a bit of misinformation and Russian propaganda on the war in Ukraine. And you interviewed these Ukrainian hackers whose way of combating that misinformation was with what was essentially more misinformation, even going as far as to blackmail these unsuspecting Russians by messaging their friends and family members dick pics, which was pretty crazy to say the least. Could you speak to these kinds of tactics that you observed and maybe what some of your takeaways were from your interactions with these hackers?
Yeah, well, I think, going into that situation or covering that story, my job, my intention isn't to be there and to go there and judge, right? It's just to to share their story, explain what they're doing, hear them explain for themselves, especially, for the format like a podcast. And, of course, like, do I think it's the most mature thing? No. Do I think it's effective? Probably not. Can I really judge them? Not really. Like, I don't know how I would react if I were a 19-year-old kid studying computer science in Ukraine, right? Like, I have no idea. I don't know how I would cope if this was happening to my country and another country was invading my country and killing people. Like, I honestly don't know. So it's it's not something that I would call an act of bravery or genius, but it's real, and it was a very human reaction to something that's happening. And I think for me, I think telling that story, it was just kind of showing, like, kind of the, not the gray areas of war, but just like, I think war is very easily reduced to, the good guys, the bad guys, and like guns and death. But like, there's so much in between that. And I think the more of that we show, the more we realize, like, how real it is, right? Like, it's a lot harder to relate to someone who's picking up guns and willing to give up their life, and probably slightly easier to relate with, like, these hacker nerds who don't know what to do besides, like, blackmail Russians and send their dick pics to all their friends and family. So I think it was just kind of a funny, humorous story, that also showed the kind of ingenuity that happens, and the way that people cope with war. And like, it also, I felt like, kind of was an exploration into, like, hate in a way. So yeah, I mean, no, I can't say I approve, but I can't really say I don't approve either. It's just, it is what it is.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I like that perspective a lot. I think for so many of us living in places that are not experiencing the shattering effects of war, it is hard to imagine how we would navigate or even conduct ourselves in such a setting. So I think you really hit the nail on the head there. Speaking of this kind of situational action and reaction, I wanted to learn a bit more about your development as a freelance journalist, because I imagine that there are certain challenges, one might face working independently as opposed to being employed by an organization. I guess I'm thinking primarily along the lines of like travel accommodations or itinerary slash equipment for shoots, or even, how you would approach a new project. Could you walk me through what that process is like and how it sort of takes shape, so to speak?
For sure. Yeah, I think sorry, there's the dogs freaking
Oh
out
no, no, no,
right
it's
now.
totally fine.
I think, being a freelancer, it's sort of an endless hustle. When the Hong Kong protests happened, I was living in Hong Kong, so it was different. I was, as a local person who was in country at the time, it was the biggest story, the biggest international story of the year. So there was a lot of work going around, and between hustling and just the amount of attention the story was getting, and being a local who spoke the local language but also English, I was very lucky that there was a lot of work going around. As for Ukraine, I need to make sure my dog doesn't get run over again. Come on first. Come on first. Dog's name is first. Yeah, Ukraine was a totally different story. Went in my first time to the country, and there was definitely a lot of soul searching amongst me and my colleagues. Are we the right people to tell the story? What can we offer? Are we going to be more of a burden than help? And we made sure we went in fully prepared. Especially being independent and freelance. We didn't want to be reckless. We brought in our own PPE, our own protective gear. We brought in gear not just for ourselves, but for anyone we hired. We always made sure we paid fair rates to the people we hired. And definitely, it's a lot more, we're driving ourselves around. We had no backup, as we're doing everything ourselves, booking everything, figuring out logistics, sleeping often in the same room, sharing accommodations, sleeping on the floor. So it's a lot more, less luxurious for sure than when you're a staffer, but at the same time, it does give you freedom and flexibility. And I think oftentimes when you do come in with a big organization, you're kind of in a bubble. We took a lot of trains. We took a lot of trains, which a lot of staff media people didn't do. And we, a lot of the time, I wasn't working with local producers or fixers. I mean, a lot of time it was, but sometimes it wasn't. So I think I felt just a lot closer to the story than maybe I would have as a staffer who came in for like a 2, 3, 4 week rotation and was only assigned to a specific area. So I think, it's pros and cons. I think as a freelancer, there's always that hustle. You're always trying to let clients know you're here. You're trying to be as proactive as possible. You have to just be a lot more situationally aware. You have to basically do a lot of people's jobs. Whereas when you're a staffer, you can focus on your one patch that you're assigned to, one story that you're assigned to, and everything else is sort of taken care of. So but it's great to be a staffer. Like, I'm not by any means putting that down. I think there should be a lot of full-time journalists. I think the media industry needs more journalists. But it's hard. You have to work really hard when you're a freelancer, but there's a lot of pros to it as well.
Going off of that, with all the difficulties and challenges that already exist as a freelancer, what has your experience in journalism been like as a woman? You have been in a variety of places and countries across the globe, and I'm sure that there has been situations and circumstances that have presented their fair share of problems. Maybe you have faced prejudice because you're a female, or even had your credibility undermined because of your gender. Could you maybe expound upon that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, it's very similar to the challenges of simply existing as a woman in this world. I think it's a lot of the same, really. I think you're generally not seen as a threat. You're not taken as seriously. You're considered, maybe something that needs to be taken care of, or maybe a little innocent or harmless. And that, like it obviously sucks and is frustrating and annoying a lot of the time. And as a woman, there's really not much you can do about how you're perceived, based on how you present. But at the same time, I think for me, the way I cope is you can use it to your advantage. On one hand, yes, like I'm never really seen as a threat, or as a danger, which is what makes me vulnerable and which makes people think they can like mess around with me, or potentially is what makes the situation dangerous for me. But on the other hand, that often gets me access that maybe like a big tall man wouldn't get. It's I think like I'm just like checkpoints were probably kind of easier for me, just because they would see a woman and be like, what harm could she possibly pose to us, wave her through, as opposed to my colleague Armin, who's like 6'5" and like bald and like wears chains. It's
uh
so in the end he would always make me sit up front. So it's like, yeah, so like on one hand that like makes it easier, but on the other hand like also means like men kind of think they like are entitled to your attention a lot of the time, and you kind of have to just tolerate that. But so I mean it's certainly different. And I would never, I wouldn't say that it's like necessarily an advantage either, a net benefit, but I think there are ways to use it to your advantage. I think women have always known how to use it to their advantage, at least to survive, but if not, at least to get something different. Because we're treated differently, at least it means that I can get different stories. I think it means I have, empathy for people in a way that maybe men wouldn't have. I think, obviously women are more willing to talk or feel more comfortable around other women, and there's spaces that are available to me that wouldn't be to men. So it's not an overwhelming advantage by any means. And there are a lot of disadvantages, but I think it just, at the end of the day, I see it as a strength in my reporting and in my journalism.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think it definitely is a strength. There are certain things that I think you do really, really well that other journalists can't do. It's interesting because as I've watched and listened to you, I get the sense that you are almost like a therapist in a way. And what I mean by that is, maybe a good journalist does this, is that you can elicit particular emotions or draw out a stream of consciousness from someone that they didn't really know that they were capable of. There is something spectacular, I think, about that kind of transparent, raw human connection. And one thing that I'm wondering is, how does one draw the balance between establishing that type of interrelational bond when pursuing a story without being too invasive? Is there a limit to how far a journalist should go to encounter that kind of vulnerability without crossing any ethical boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure, like, I think in any situation where you're talking to vulnerable people, like, of course, like the priority is their comfort, their well-being, their safety, their security, and it's never the story. So I think, I have a good friend of mine who's a journalist, and she told me once, human first, journalist second. And I think that's
Oh, I love that. That's really good.
yeah, yeah. And that's kind of a guiding principle, right? Like at the end of the day, like we're all human beings, and it's not about you as a journalist. It's not about the story. It's not certainly not about your career. And if someone doesn't feel comfortable talking to you or sharing their story with you or opening up, like of course that's okay. I think, of course, like that said, there's like a certain level of skill and experience that comes into it. I think it's a lot of times very intuitive, and it comes down to maybe, maybe what you can call emotional intelligence, just knowing when someone is truly unwilling to talk, or someone like actually does kind of want to tell their story, but maybe just needs some warming up. And I think going back to sort of what we were saying about, being a woman and getting people to open up, I think when you're asking for someone to do something so selfless, right? To share their story with you for no other reason than to share it with the world and have the world understand. I think it's an exchange. If I'm going to ask someone to be vulnerable, I'll certainly try to be as present and sort of be vulnerable in a way myself. I think it's a reciprocal thing to some extent, which is also what makes it hard as a journalist, because it's you're kind of always giving a bit of yourself emotionally in all these exchanges too, unless you're dead inside, which also happens to some journalists. But yeah, it's always delicate, and I think you kind of, as a journalist, have to know where your own ethical lines are and kind of stick to that. And it's important to be grounded and remember that it's never about you. It's if you're causing more harm to the people that you're doing the story on, then you really have to reconsider why you're there.
Wow. Very beautifully said. Okay, I have one last question for you. I was watching your TED Talk yesterday, and I really, really loved the way you ended it. You quoted a Senegalese conservationist, and I hope I don't get this wrong, but you said, in the end, we will conserve only what we love, we will love only what we will understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. But you revised that quote with your own rendition and said, in the end, we will only conserve love and understand only what we explore. Well, you have been to a multitude of places, interacting with a variety of people. My question for you is, how has your exploration of the world allowed you to gain a better understanding and a broader perspective of humanity as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, um, I think for me, a lot of the world's problems, I think, could be solved if we all just understood that we're all a lot more connected than we think, that we're all a lot more similar than we think, that things happening far away are still relevant to us, and that, what we do affects people far away, and not just like geographically, but like temporally, right? Like, I think for me, that's the huge privilege of being able to travel so much and learn so much constantly on the job, is just, the more I understand, the more nothing really seems all that foreign or different or ununderstandable. I think at the end of the day, maybe that's just a bit trite, but like at the end of the day, we're all people. And like, I think, for example, Ukraine, like, I want people to understand that the people this is happening to aren't all that different from you and I, and all the suffering and tragedy in the world could easily happen to you and I. Like, it's just different circumstances that have us end up in these wildly different situations and lives. So I think, yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think it's a huge privilege and a huge privilege to be able to see so much of the world and learn so much about it and talk to so many people for my job. And I think the responsibility that comes from that is using your skills and knowledge and experience to try to convey that to other people, so that they don't have to necessarily go to all these spaces themselves to develop that same empathy and understanding about the world and other people.
Very powerful. Well, Laurel, thank you so, so much for your time. It has been truly an honor.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Bye, everybody.